There's something calming, even comforting, about turning our minds back to times past. When we listen to the voices of our ancestors, their thoughts, their joys, and even their fears. In this video, let's step away from the noise of our modern world and take a quiet peek at true stories of fairies' sightings and encounters in Scotland, as collected by American author Evans-Wentz and published in 1911. Evans-Wentz sat down face to face over tea or whiskey in front of a burning fire or sitting on stones in a lush field of green and recorded these true stories. I hope you will enjoy them. A fairy woman visited the house of a young wife here in Barra, and the young wife had her baby on her breast at the time. The first words uttered by the fairy woman were, "Heavy is your child," and the wife answered, "Light is everybody who lives the longest." "Were it not that you have answered my question," said the fairy woman, "and understood my meaning, you should have been less your child." And then the fairy woman departed. My grandmother, Catherine McGuinness, used to tell about a man named Lachlan whom she knew being in love with a fairy woman. The fairy woman made it a point to see Lachlan every night, and he, being worn out with her, began to fear her. Things got so bad at last that he decided to go to America to escape the fairy woman. As soon as the plan was fixed and he was about to emigrate, women who were milking at sunset out in the meadows heard very audibly the fairy woman singing this song. "What will the brown-haired woman do when Lachlan is on the billows?" Lachlan emigrated to Cape Breton, landing in Nova Scotia, and in his first letter home to his friends, he stated that the same fairy woman was haunting him there in America. I have heard it from old people that a couple, newly married, were on their way to the home of the bride's father, and for some unknown reason, the groom fell behind the procession and, seeing a fairy dwelling open along the road, was taken into it. No one could ever find the least trace of where he went, and all hope of seeing him again was given up. That man remained with the fairies so long that when he returned, 2 generations had disappeared during the lapse of time. The township in which his bride's house used to be was depopulated and in ruins for upwards of 20 years, but to him the time had seemed only a few hours, and when he returned with his story, he was just as fresh and youthful as when he went into the fairy dwelling. Some people after death are seen in their old haunts, no mistake about it. A bailiff had false corn and meal measures, and so after he died he came back to his daughter and told her he could have no peace until the measures were fixed. She complied with her father's wish, and his spirit was never seen again. I have known also of phantom funerals of people who died soon afterwards being seen on the road at night. There is a story told of the MacLeod family. Soon after the heir of the MacLeods was born, a beautiful woman in wonderful clothes who was a fairy woman or banshee. There were joyous as well as mourning banshees, appeared at the castle and went directly to the babe's cradle. She took up the babe and chanted over it a series of verses, and each verse had its own melody. The verses foretold the future manhood of the young child and acted as a protective charm over his life. Then she put the babe back into its cradle and, going out, disappeared across the moorlands. For many generations it was a custom in the MacLeod family that whoever was the nurse of the heir must sing those verses just as the fairy woman had sung them. After a time, the song was forgotten, but at a later period it was partially recovered, and today it is one of the proud folklore heritages of the MacLeod family. An aged nurse who had fallen fast asleep as she sat by the fire was holding on her knees a newly born babe. The mother, who lay in bed gazing dreamily, was astonished to see 3 strange little women enter the dwelling. They approached the unconscious child, and she, who seemed to be their leader, was on the point of lifting it off the nurse's lap, when the third exclaimed, "Oh, let us leave this one with her, as we have already taken so many." "So be it," replied the senior of the party in a tone of displeasure. "But when that peat, now burning on the hearth, shall be consumed, her life will surely come to an end." Then the 3 little figures passed out. The good wife, recognizing them to be fairies, sprang from her bed and poured over the fire all the water she could find and extinguished the half-burnt ember. This she wrapped carefully in a piece of cloth and deposited at the very bottom of a large chest, which afterwards she always kept locked. Years passed, and the babe grew into a beautiful young woman. In the course of time she was betrothed and, according to custom, not appearing in public at church on the Sunday preceding the day appointed for her marriage, she remained at home alone. To amuse herself, she began to search the contents of all the keeping places in the house, and came at last to the chest containing the peat ember. In her haste, the good mother had that day forgotten the key of the chest, which was now in the lock. At the bottom of the chest, the girl found a curious packet containing nothing but a morsel of peat, and this apparently useless thing she tossed away into the fire. When the peat was well kindled, the young girl began to feel very ill, and by the time her mother returned, she was dying. The open chest and the blazing peat explained the cause of the calamity. The fairy's prediction was fulfilled. They were a small people dressed in green and had dwellings underground in dry spots. Fairies were often heard in the hills just over there, and I believe there was something there. They were awful for music and used to be heard very often playing the bagpipes. A woman wouldn't go out in the dark after giving birth to a child before that child was christened, so as not to give the fairies power over her or the child. And I have heard people say that if fairies were refused milk and meat, they would just take a horse or a cow, and that if well treated, they would repay all gifts. I can remember how an old woman once pulled me out of a fairy ring to save me from being taken. If a mother takes some bindweed and places it burnt at the ends over her babe's cradle, the fairies have no power over that child. Bindweed is common along the roadside. I remember well as a boy, I saw two old women passing a babe over red-hot coals and then drop some of the cinders in a cup of water and give the water to the babe to drink in order to cure it of a fairy stroke. It is a common belief now that on Halloween the fairies, or the fairy hosts, have fights. Lichens on rocks after there had been a frost get yellowish red, and then when they thaw and the moisture spreads out from them, the rocks are a bright red, and this bright red is said to be the blood of the fairies after one of their battles. A man who was a humpback once met the fairies dancing and danced with their queen, and he sang with them, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, so well that they took off his hump and he returned home a straight-bodied man. The very same night, a tailor went past the same place and was also admitted by the fairies to their dance. He caught the fairy queen by the waist, and she resented his familiarity, and when singing, he added Thursday to their song and spoiled it. To pay the tailor for his rudeness and ill manners, the dancers took up the hump they had just removed from the first man and clapped it on his back, and the conceited fellow went home a humpback. An elder in my church knew a woman who was accustomed, in milking her cows, to offer libations to the fairies. This woman was later converted to Christ and gave up the practice, and as a result, one of her cows was taken by the fairies. Then she revived the practice. I believe people saw fairies, but I think one reason no one sees them now is because every place in this parish where they used to appear has been put into sheep and deer and grouse and shooting. Before the big sheep came, the fairies are supposed to have had a premonition that their domains were to be violated by them. There is a story told here of a fight between the sheep and the fairies, and of the fairies hunting the sheep. James McQueen, who could traffic with the fairies, whom he regarded as ghosts or spirits, one night on his old place, which now is in Sheep, was lying down all alone and heard a small and big barking of dogs and a small and big bleating of sheep, though no sheep were there then. It was the fairy hunting he heard. I put an axe under my head, and I had no fear therefore, he always repeated when telling the story. I believe that man saw and heard something, and McQueen used to aid the fairies and on that account, as he was in the habit of saying, he always found more meal in his chest than he thought he had. 2 women were walking toward the point when one of them, hearing churning going on under a hillock, expressed aloud a wish for some buttermilk. No sooner had she spoken than a very small figure of a woman came out with a bowlful and offered it to her, but the thirsty woman, ignorant of fairy customs and the penalty attending their infringement, declined the kind offer of refreshment and immediately found herself a prisoner in the hillock. She was led to an apartment containing a chest full of meal and a great bag of wool, and was told by the fairy that when she had eaten all the meal and spun all the wool, she would be free to return to her home. The prisoner at once set herself to eating and spinning, but without apparent result, and despairing of completing the task, consulted an old man of very sad countenance who had been long a captive in the hillock. He willingly gave her his advice, which was to wet her left eye with saliva each morning before she settled down to her task. She followed this advice, and gradually the wool and the meal were exhausted. Then the fairy granted her freedom, but in doing so cursed the old man. I never saw any myself, and so cannot tell, but they must be spirits from all that the old people tell about them, or else how could they appear and disappear so suddenly? The old people said they didn't know if fairies were flesh and blood or spirits. They saw them as men of smaller stature than our race. I heard my father say that fairies used to come and speak to natural people and then vanish while one was looking at them. Fairy women used to go into houses and talk and then vanish. The general belief was that the fairies were spirits who could make themselves seen or not seen at will. And when they took people, they took their body and soul together. I had a companion by the name of James Galbraith who was drowned about 40 years ago, and one time he was crossing from the west side of the island to the east side and, feeling thirsty, took a drink out of a spring well on the mountainside. After he had taken a drink, he looked about him and saw a woman clad in green, and imagined that no woman would be clad in such a colour except a fairy woman. He quickly went on his way, but when he hadn't gone far, he looked back, and as he looked, he saw the fairy woman vanish out of his sight. He afterwards reported the incident to his father, and his father said that he also had seen a strange woman clad in clothes of green at the same place some nights before. I heard my father say that a neighbour of his father, that is, of my grandfather, was married twice and had 3 children from the first marriage, and when married for the second time, a son and a daughter. His second wife did not seem to be kind enough to the children of the first wife, neglecting their food and clothing and keeping them constantly at hard work in the fields and at herding. One morning, when the man and his second wife were returning from Mass, they passed the pasture where their cows were grazing and heard the enjoyable skirls of the bagpipes. The father said, "What may this be?" and going off the road, found the eldest son of the first wife playing the bagpipes to his heart's pleasure, and he asked him earnestly, "How did you come to play the bagpipes so suddenly, and where did you get this splendid pair of pipes?" The boy replied, "An old man came to me while I was in the action of roasting pots in a pit fire and said, 'Your stepmother is bad to you and has ill will towards you.' I told the old man I was sensible that that was the case, and then he said to me, 'If I give you a trade, will you be inclined to follow it?' I said yes, and the old man then continued, 'How would you like to be a piper by trade?' 'I would gladly become a piper,' says I, 'but what am I to do without the bagpipes and the tunes to play?' 'I'll supply the bagpipes,' he said to me, 'and as long as you have them, you'll never want for the most delightful tunes.'" The male descendants of the boy in question were all famous pipers thereafter. The general belief of the people here during my father's lifetime was that the fairies were more of the nature of spirits than of men made of flesh and blood, but that they so appeared to the naked eye that no difference could be marked in their forms from that of any human being, except that they were much smaller. I've heard my father say that it was the case that fairy women used to take away children from their cradles and leave different children in their places, and that these children who were left would turn out to be old men. I have heard it said that the fairies live in knolls on a higher level than that of the ground in general, and that fairy songs are heard from the faces of high rocks. The fairies of the air, the fairy or spirit hosts, are different from those in the rocks. A man whom I've seen, Roderick MacLeod, was lifted by the hosts and left 3 miles from where he was taken up. The hosts go about at midnight. A man awake at midnight is in great danger of them. I heard of an apprentice to carpentry who was working with his master at the building of a boat, a little distance from this house and near the sea. He went to work one morning and forgot a certain tool which he needed in the boat building. So he returned to his carpenter shed to get it and found the shed filled with fairy men and women. On seeing him, they ran away, so greatly confused that one of the little women forgot her belt, and he picked it up. In a little while, she came back for the belt and asked him to give it to her, but he refused to do so. Thereupon, she promised him that he should be made master of his trade wherever his lot should fall, without serving further apprenticeship. On that condition, he gave her the belt, and, rising early next morning, he went to the yard where the boat was a building and put in 2 planks so perfectly that when the master arrived and saw them, he said to him, "Are you aware of anybody being in the building yard last night? For I see by the work done that I am more likely to be an apprentice than the person who put in those 2 planks, whoever he was. Was it you that did it?" The reply was in the affirmative, and the apprentice told his master the circumstances under which he gained the rapid mastership of his trade. Generally, the fairies are to be seen after or about sunset and walk on the ground just as we do, whereas the hosts travel in the air above places inhabited by people. The hosts used to be seen after the fall of night, and more particularly about midnight. You'd hear them going in fine weather against a wind, and they were in the habit of lifting men in southwest, for the hosts need men to help in shooting their javelins from their bows against anyone in the action of milking cows, or against any person working at night in a house over which they pass. And I have heard of good, sensible men whom the hosts took, shooting a horse or cow in place of the person they were ordered to shoot. There was a man who had only one cow and one daughter. The daughter was milking the cow at night when the hosts were passing, and that human being whom the hosts had lifted with them was her father's neighbour. And this neighbour was ordered by the hosts to shoot the daughter as she was milking, but knowing the father and the daughter, he shot the cow instead. The next morning he went where the father was and said to him, "You are missing the cow." "Yes," said the father, "I am." And the man who had shot the cow said, "Are you not glad your cow and not your daughter was taken? For I was ordered to shoot your daughter, but I shot your cow in order to show blood on my arrow." "I am very glad of what you have done, if that was the case," the father replied. "It was the case," the neighbour said. "My father and grandfather knew a man who was carried by the hosts from southwest here to Barra. I understand when the hosts take away earthly men, they require another man to help them, but the hosts must be spirits. My opinion is that they are both spirits of the dead and other spirits, not the dead. A child was taken by the hosts and returned after one night and one day, and found at the back of the house with the palms of its hands in the holes in the wall, and with no life in its body. It was dead in the spirit. It is believed that when people are dropped from a great height by the hosts, they are killed by the fall. As to fairies, my firm opinion is that they are spirits who appear in the shape of human beings. I have heard my father, Alexander MacLeod, say that his father knew a woman in the neighbourhood who was in a hurry to have her stock of wool spun and made into cloth, and one night this woman secretly wished to have some women to help her. So the following morning there appeared at her house 6 or 7 fairy women in long green robes, all saying, "A wool card and a spinning wheel, a wool card and a spinning wheel." And when they were supplied with the instruments they were so very desirous to get, they all set to work, and by midday of that morning the cloth was going through the process of the hand loom. But they were not satisfied with finishing the work the woman had set before them. They asked for new employment. The woman had no more spinning or weaving to be done, and began to wonder how she was to get the women out of her house. So she went into her neighbour's house and informed him of her position in regard to these fairy women. The old man asked what they were saying. "They are earnestly petitioning for some work to do, and I have no more to give them," the woman replied. "Go you in," he said to her, "and tell them to spin the sand, and if then they do not move from your house, go out again and yell in at the door that Dunborv is in fire." Well, the first plan had no effect, but immediately on hearing the cry, "Dunborv is on fire," the fairy women disappeared invisibly, and as they went, the woman heard the melancholy wail, "Dunborv is in fire, Dunborv is in fire, and what will become of our hammers and anvil? For there was a smithy in the fairy dwelling." There was a young wife of a young man who lived in the township of Alasdale, and the pair had just had their first child. One day the mother left her baby in its cradle to go out and do some shearing, and when she returned, the child was crying in a most unusual fashion. She fed him, as usual, on porridge and milk, but he wasn't satisfied with what seemed to her enough for anyone of his age. Yet every suspicion escaped her attention. As it happened, at the time there was a web of homemade cloth in the house waiting for the tailor. The tailor came that day and began to work up the cloth. As the woman was going out to her customary shearing operation, she warned the tailor if he heard the child continually crying not to pay much attention to it, adding she would attend to it when she came home, for she feared the child would delay him in his work. All went well till about noon, when the tailor observed the child rising up on its elbow and stretching its hand to a sort of shelf above the cradle, and taking down from it a yellow chanter of a bagpipe. And then the child began to play. Immediately after the child began to play the chanter, the house filled with young fairy women, all clad in long green robes, who began to dance, and the tailor was forced to dance with them. About 2 o'clock that same afternoon, the women disappeared, and the chanter disappeared from the hands of the child, and the child just lay in the cradle, crying as usual. The wife came home to make the dinner and observed that the tailor was not so far advanced with his work as he ought to have been. After the fairy women had disappeared, the child had enjoined upon the tailor never to tell what he had seen. The tailor promised to be faithful to the child's injunctions, and so he said nothing to the mother. The second day the wife left for her occupation as usual and told the tailor to be more attentive to his work than he had the day before. A second time, at the same hour of the day, the child in the cradle, appearing more like an old man than a child, took the chanter and began to play. The same fairy women filled the house again and repeated their dance, and the tailor again was forced to join them. Naturally, the tailor was far behind with his work the second day as he had the first day, and it was very noticeable to the woman of the house when she returned. She thereupon requested him to tell her what the matter might be. Then he said to her, "I urge upon you, after going to bed tonight, not to hold that child, because he is not your child, nor is he a child, he is an old fairy man. and tomorrow, at dead tide, go down to the shore and wrap him in your plaid and put him upon a rock and begin to pick that shellfish which is called limpet. And for your life do not leave the shore until such a time as the tide will flow so high that you will scarcely be able to wade in to the main shore." The woman complied with the tailor's advice, and when she had waded to the main shore and stood there looking at the child on the rock, it cried to her, "You had a great need to do what you have done, otherwise you'd have seen another ending of your turn, but blessing be to you and curses on your adviser." When the wife arrived home, her own natural child was in the cradle. When I was a boy, I was a firm believer in fairies, and now, as a Christian minister, I believe in the possibility and also the reality of these spiritual orders. But I wish only to know those orders which belong to the realm of grace. It is quite certain that they exist. I have been in a state of ecstasy and have seen spiritual beings which form these orders. I believe in the actuality of evil spirits, but people in the Highlands, having put aside paganism, evil spirits are not seen now.